What is goodwill? We will discuss the definition of the finance and accounting term goodwill and make sense of how goodwill works by discussing one of the largest technology acquisitions in recent history, the acquisition of social network LinkedIn by Microsoft. We will review the calculation of goodwill for that headline-grabbing deal, which is a great example of how to record goodwill on the balance sheet. For some companies, goodwill is in the top 3 of largest categories of assets on their balance sheet. If you want to make sense of a company's financial statements, then the basic understanding of the concept of goodwill is invaluable. Let's start with the definition of goodwill. Please don't panic if this sounds somewhat cryptic to you. It will all become clear very soon. Goodwill is the excess of the purchase price paid for an acquired firm over the fair value of its separately identifiable net assets. Let's illustrate the definition of goodwill with an example. The businessman in the blue suit and the businessman in the red suit come to an agreement. Blue pays a larger sum of money to red, and in return red transfers the ownership of a factory to blue. How does goodwill come into this picture? If the purchase price is $3 billion and the net assets are $2 billion, then the difference of $1 billion is goodwill. You could disrespectfully call goodwill an accounting plug in order to make the journal entry balance. If $3 billion of cash leaves the door, and on paper I only get net assets of $2 billion in return, then I need to plug $1 billion somewhere in order for the debits to equal the credits. So here is the definition of goodwill in simpler terms. Goodwill is the difference between what a company pays to buy an acquisition target and what that acquired company is worth on paper. Goodwill is recognized only in a business combination, and goodwill is not amortized. Why would any acquiring company pay a premium for an acquisition target above what that company's net assets are worth? Goodwill reflects the perceived superior earnings capacity of the business combination. Let's make the concept of goodwill come alive by reviewing one of the most exciting technology deals of 2016, the acquisition of social network LinkedIn by Microsoft. On June 13, 2016, Microsoft and LinkedIn announced that Microsoft will acquire LinkedIn for $196 per share, which adds up to a purchase price of $26.2 billion. The transaction had been unanimously approved by the boards of directors of both LinkedIn and Microsoft, and the CEOs of both companies held a joint conference call to explain the rationale of the deal and their optimism for the opportunities created when combining the companies. Nearly 6 months later, on December 8, 2016, the deal closed, once regulatory approvals had been obtained. $26 billion was a very large purchase price, including a significant premium. Microsoft believes the benefits of the business combination between the world's leading professional cloud and the world's leading professional network justify the deal. So how does the accounting for goodwill work in the Microsoft LinkedIn acquisition? Microsoft's filing with the SEC of its FY17 Q2 quarterly report on January 26, 2017, which is called a 10Q filing, gives us the answers we are looking for. Goodwill is recorded as an asset on the balance sheet, so let's look up Microsoft's balance sheet per the end of the quarter, December 31st, 2016. If we look at the left-hand side of the balance sheet, we get a listing of the assets on the balance sheet date. Goodwill is a non-current or long-term asset, so we need to look towards the bottom of the list, as the balance sheet for American companies starts with the most liquid assets, cash and items that are ready to convert to cash, and ends with the least liquid assets. There we have it. Goodwill per December 31st, 2016 at $34.5 billion, the second largest line item out of the balance sheet with a total of $224.6 billion in assets. Goodwill has increased by $16.7 billion since June 30, 2016. More detail on how the deal was accounted for can be found in the notes to the financial statements, more specifically in Note 8, Business Combinations. Microsoft states, on December 8th we completed the acquisition of LinkedIn for $27 billion. Most of the purchase price was cash. The acquisition is expected to accelerate the growth of LinkedIn, Office 365 and Dynamics 365. The purchase price allocation as of the date of the acquisition was based on a preliminary valuation and is subject to revision. In other words, this is the accounting for the time being. It might change, so check the annual report once the full fiscal year is complete. It is good to remember that a quarterly report publishes unaudited financial statements, while an annual report has audited financial statements. Here is the overview of the purchase price allocation. $27 billion paid in total. What does Microsoft get in return? First of all, LinkedIn's tangible assets, such as cash and cash equivalents, short-term investments, other current assets, and property and equipment. This adds up to $5.7 billion. If you acquire a company, you don't just take on the assets, what the company owns, you also take up the liabilities, what a company owes. LinkedIn's liabilities that Microsoft took on were primarily short-term debt, other current liabilities, and deferred income taxes. This added up to $3.4 billion. Microsoft paid $27 billion in total, got tangible net assets in return of $5.7 billion minus $3.4 billion is $2.3 billion. So is the rest of the amount to be booked as goodwill? Not quite. In an acquisition, you first have to figure out what the value is of the intangible assets, non-monetary assets without physical substance. Microsoft's valuation of the intangible assets that were acquired by purchasing LinkedIn is $7.9 billion. Valuation of intangible assets is a separate topic, which is out of scope for this video. The important thing for us in this discussion of the purchase price allocation, based on fixed amount of purchase price and tangible net assets, is that if the value of intangible assets is high, then goodwill will be low, and if the value of intangible assets is low, then goodwill will be high. Microsoft assessed the fair value of the intangible assets acquired as $7.9 billion. The intangible assets are thought to have a useful life of 9 years on average and will be amortized over this period. On average, this will lead to an incremental amortization charge for Microsoft due to the LinkedIn deal of $875 million per year. Now that we have looked at all the items except goodwill, we have a fair value of the net assets of $5.7 billion plus $7.9 billion minus $3.4 billion is $10.2 billion. The purchase price is $27 billion. The fair value of the net assets $10.2 billion. Therefore, goodwill is $16.8 billion. So is that it? Amortize the intangible assets over their useful lives? Keep goodwill on the balance sheet forever, as goodwill is never amortized? Not necessarily. Check the risk factors section of Microsoft's 10Q. Companies have to perform an annual impairment test to both goodwill and intangible assets. What that impairment test does is basically to assess whether the carrying value of goodwill intangible assets is recoverable. In simple terms, if the financial results and future prospects of the business you acquired are dramatically dropping, you need to write off all or part of the goodwill and intangible assets. Microsoft acquired Nokia's devices and services business for a total purchase price of $9.4 billion on April 25, 2014. During the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2015, just over 1 year later, almost all of the goodwill and half of the intangible assets of that deal were written off due to impairment. Time will tell whether the acquisition of LinkedIn by Microsoft will live up to the optimistic strategic and financial expectations. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this discussion of the definition of goodwill and the example of how to calculate goodwill, then please press the like button for me. On this end screen, there are a few suggestions of videos you can watch next. Please subscribe to the Finance Storyteller channel so you can stay up to date on my latest videos for free. Thank you.